Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing another Sharks player review, but we will be doing things a little bit differently here. Usually I will be focusing on one player in my reviews, discussing their history with the San Jose Sharks, the role they play on the team in the past and in the going into the future, as well as, of course, generally focusing on their performance through the 22-23 season. But this video will be slightly different, as instead I'll be focusing on three different players, and you may be wondering why that is. Well, there are a multitude of reasons, the first of which being is that neither of these three players actually have any sort of history with the San Jose Sharks. All three of them were acquired this past offseason, Svechnikov and Lindblom as free agent signings, while Lorentz was acquired in the Brent Burns trade. On top of that, two of these three players are not even with the organization anymore. Svechnikov was not re-signed, and Lorentz was traded for Anthony Duclair to the Florida Panthers. Only Lindblom still remains under the Sharks umbrella, and even then, it feels as though with the acquisitions that they have made, like Duclair, like Philip Zadina, as well as some of the development that is expected from some of the Sharks rookies like Eklund and Bordelot, and perhaps even a couple of other players with an outside shot, it's likely, or at least hopefully, that Lindblom will be not really much of a factor on the main roster for the San Jose Sharks, and perhaps be a pretty usual healthy scratch player for the Sharks. And so these players are essentially just having come and gone over this past season. On top of that, even in the season that they did play, they're not really impact type of players. All three of them pretty much more or less stapled to the bottom six, and primarily even the fourth line. None of these three players actually managed to even hit the dozen minutes in terms of ice time. And so generally these are players that don't really have much of a history. They didn't really have much of a role. And so focusing on them for multiple minutes wouldn't have really made for a very interesting video. So instead, since they do still deserve to be talked about, I'll be focusing on them for a couple of minutes in this one video about all three of them. So let us start off with Evgeny Svechnikov, signed this past offseason. Pretty much a league minimum deal here for Svechnikov, the less successful of the Svechnikov brothers, as Andre is having a ton of success with the Carolina Hurricanes. Meanwhile, Evgeny bounced around a couple of teams, now ends up on the San Jose Sharks. Had a very strong start to the season, I guess, through the first few games on a line with Nico Sturm and Jonah Gadjevich as the fourth line. They looked quite good, but they were so good that they got bumped up to being the third line, and it might not seem like that much of a difference between fourth line and third line, but the level of competition does still go up, and the line now struggled, and Svechnikov in particular struggled in this new expanded role, and that was just generally the theme for Evgeny Svechnikov this season. While there were some decent stretches, especially in the sort of latter part of the season, he never really looked all that great, and even though he did get some time in the top six, in fact, he even had a couple of games where he was playing on a line with both Timo Meier and Tomas Hertl, he never really excelled in that particular role, and just generally was a pretty inconsequential player, I guess you could say, for the Sharks. And so if you take a look at his stats, 59 games played, some of that due to injury, but others due to healthy scratch for sure. 8 goals, 6 assists for 14 points. A -6 is honestly pretty decent for a player who was jumping up and down the lineup. The fact that he was a pretty small minus is quite good. And then in terms of time on ice, 10 minutes and 45 seconds. Like I said, not a very impact player for the San Jose Sharks, but I wasn't really expecting him to be either. The contract that he signed obviously indicated that he wasn't going to be a huge deal for the San Jose Sharks, and as such he gets the grade pretty much right down the middle of a C. When it comes to Steven Lorentz, he was a player acquired in the relatively underwhelming trade for Brent Burns, or trading away Brent Burns, I should say. The Sharks acquired a third-round pick. They acquired goaltending prospect Eetu Mäkiniemi, who's pretty good, but maybe not in the upper echelon of goaltending prospects. And Lorentz seemed to sort of just be a throw-in type of player who would be like a maybe borderline fourth liner, but likely 13th forward, healthy scratch kind of guy. But he ended up playing the vast majority of the season for the Sharks, 80 of the 82 games, and actually played rather well through those games, mostly on the fourth line, a lot of the time with Oskar Lindblom, who I will also be reviewing here in this video. But there were times where he could get flexed up a bit to the third line. I know at the end of the season he even got some time on the second line, which is not particularly recommended for a player of his caliber, but perhaps it was like a reward for having served the team well as a fourth line center for so long. 10 goals, 9 assists for 19 points. 10 goals as a fourth line center on a team that isn't necessarily scoring at will like the San Jose Sharks is actually rather good, so that was nice to see. What does stand out in a bit of a bad way would be his plus minus of a -18. Usually for a fourth line forward, you're able to actually escape somewhat the fact that you're on a bad team and so you're giving up a lot of goals, because the fourth line doesn't really play all that many minutes. And so the fact that a more defensive fourth line is still managing to hit minus 18 is not a very good compliment of Steven Lorentz, but at the very least, I think some of the offensive capabilities do slightly outweigh. He actually had a good amount of high danger chances individually for himself, so that was pretty good to see. And I thought he was just all around a solid player and a solid acquisition from a trade that, like I said, appeared very underwhelming on the surface for Sharks fans. And in terms of time on ice, 11 minutes and 50 seconds. While he doesn't quite hit the dozen-minute mark, he is the player with the most ice time out of the two other players who I'm also reviewing in this video, and as such, he gets the grade of a B- for outperforming my expectations, even though they were rather low. And then finally, we have Oskar Lindblom, which, speaking of expectations, had the highest out of the three players in this video. Lindblom was signed and expected to be a potential offensive option at the very least for the third line, with even the possibility of flexing up into the top six if he actually performed at that level, but at the very least give him, like 30, 35 points on the year. And the contract that he was given by Mike Greer was an indication that that was indeed what they were expecting from him at $2.5 million over the 2 years, or $2.5 million per year over 2 years. And yet, in 73 games played, he had just 6 goals and 9 assists for 15 points, for definitely coming in under what you would expect. At $2.5 million, that is just not nearly enough offensive output. I mean, Lorentz, at almost league minimum pretty much, is putting up 10 goals while you're only managing to get 6. And even just the eye test, this is not a situation like with perhaps Noah Gregor, where he was just extremely snake-bitten and unlucky. Lindblom was just more or less invisible for, out of these 73 games, I would say at least 50 of them, you barely even noticed that Lindblom was actually in the lineup. And so while he somehow managed to maintain a lineup spot more often than not this past season, going into next year, like I mentioned, he very much should be a healthy scratch more often than not, unless he actually completely turns his game around, because it just will be an absolute crime against humanity if Lindblom actually manages to lock down a fourth line spot while someone like Thomas Bordeleau or William Eklund ends up being a healthy scratch. When it comes to his plus minus, as expected, considering he played the vast majority of the season with Steven Lorentz, his plus minus is very close to Lorentz's at a minus 16, and then his time on ice is actually the lowest out of the three players here at 10 minutes and 34 seconds, frequently even coming in at just like 5, 6, 7 minutes per game. And as such, because the expectations were definitely higher for him compared to the other two players, even though he wasn't necessarily that much worse than them, he does get a worse grade for sure at a D. Class dismissed.